Good afternoon. This is Shandon with Altair Global. Welcome and thank you for attending today's webinar, Altair Global International Momentum Survey, the results. Before we get started, I'd like to take a minute to address a few housekeeping items. Altair has submitted this webinar to Worldwide ERC for 1 CRP recertification credit and also to the Human Resources Certification Institute for 1 hour of general HR credit. Both ERC and HRCI use a self-service model for submitting credit, and we have included the activity IDs and instructions on how to request credit on the continuing education slide in the handout sent before the webinar. If you did not receive this handout, please let us know in the question and answer window, and we'll make sure you receive a copy. There's also a slide covering that material at the end of this presentation, and I'll spend a few minutes on that as well as we near the end. Please be advised that your phones have been muted by our phone system. If you have questions during the presentation, please submit it in the question and answer window on your screen. We'll try to respond to each question during the Q&A period at the end of the broadcast. So on to our topic today. Relocating is one of the most stressful things I've ever done. It's a common refrain in our industry, so common that in our little corner of the world, it's almost a fact of life. But just think about it. If something takes that much of a toll on an employee's personal life, then you would have to think that some of that same stress might follow them to their job and begin impacting their focus and their productivity. In the very short order, you could have personal stress becoming a loss of production at work. When we get into that, we're talking about a real business issue. So how do we address it? Well, Altair Global is back today with another groundbreaking survey from our Momentum Survey series. This time, we're examining how international relocation and international assignments impact work productivity. Join Altair's own Vice President of Global Consulting Services, Mary Beth Nitz, and independent global mobility consultant, Julian Yates, as we examine, identify, and validate the mobility-related events that impact employees' on-the-job focus and, as a result, their company's bottom lines. As Vice President of Global Consulting Services, Mary Beth is responsible for the overall operations of our Global Consulting Services team. Since starting her relocation career in 1992, she has acquired extensive experience in human resources, relocation, and global consulting. Her career in the mobility industry includes roles as a client services manager, director of global consulting, and an executive recruiter. Julian Yates is an independent and experienced global mobility consultant with over 30 years of global mobility and international HR experience. He has held assignments in the United States, Europe, and Asia, both as a corporate client and as a service provider. He is considered a subject matter expert on global assignment policy and program development and has published multiple thought leadership articles. Mary Beth and Julian have put a lot of work into the research and the administration of this survey, so we look forward to hearing their findings, their insight, and their conclusions. Without further ado, I'd like to get our presentation started with Mary Beth Nitz. Mary Beth?
Thank you, Shan. Much appreciated. Thank you, everybody, as well, for joining us today and being a part of this. This has been a journey that we've been on now for over 2 years, and I'm incredibly excited to share the information and the data from this latest study and this latest iteration in the Momentum Survey series focused on international relocation. So I'd like to just start out with a quick refresher. Some of you who are joining us today have actually been on this journey with us, and we appreciate that. And it's important to go back and look where this all began and really the impetus behind starting this journey and diving into this initiative. So why did we decide initially to study employee productivity? As many of you are aware, within our industry, this is a topic that's never statistically been validated until now. We really never saw any baseline data that existed on the impact of mobility related to an employee's work productivity. And so, of course, that provided us with a clear path that we could go down to explore this interesting topic. We also, of course, wanted to help companies understand specifically where the productivity drains exist within their particular employee populations. And with that, work to identify solutions, to come up with innovative and creative ideas, and maybe even look at the way that we conduct business differently in order to address those productivity drains. Finally, the most important thing is to understand the actual dollars associated with this productivity impact, the financial loss that a company might experience, as well as financial benefit that a company might experience addressing the productivity drain and identifying those solutions to combat the productivity drain. So that's really a high-level look at why we launched this overarching series. I also want to just jump back for a moment and provide some highlights from the U.S. domestic study that we conducted previously. This was conducted at the tail end of 2014 into 2015, and we've spent the better part of the last 12 months traveling around the United States and presenting this data to various regional groups and corporations. So I want to provide just a quick look at the data that we gleaned from the U.S. domestic study, and that will really help set the stage for the data we're going to share today from the international study. For the U.S. domestic study, we had 546 respondents, and that equated to a 44% response rate. We had a great mix of homeowners and renters, 60% homeowners and 40% renters, as well as a great mix of individuals coming with or moving with different family sizes. As you can see on the right side of the slide that's on the screen right now, we listed the top productivity impacts that were identified through the U.S. domestic study. And if you were able to participate or join us for any of the webinars or presentations where we dove into those productivity impacts, the result of that study was some amazingly interesting and insightful conversations around how we as an industry can work to alleviate and help eliminate some of those productivity impacts. Finally, the really key and pivotal data that came out of the U.S. domestic study was the actual number of days that we found employees losing throughout the relocation process. Homeowners that responded to the U.S. domestic study lost a minimum of 19.8 days of work productivity, and renters lost a minimum of 15.6 days of work productivity. And then, of course, out of that study, we developed a calculator that allowed organizations to look at the bottom line and the financial impact of that lost productivity. So what we're sharing here is just, again, a snapshot of what you might see as a result from that calculator, using the days that were identified as being lost by employees through the U.S. domestic study and then looking at the annual lost productivity cost. This is the real pivotal information and critical information and data that came out of that study, and a lot of the companies that participated over the past year have used this data to initiate change and affect change within their organizations and implement different solutions to combat the productivity loss. So let's jump into the international study and take a look at the participants that we had that took part in this interesting survey. Employees that we had participate in this survey or in this study moved under either a formal international permanent transfer or one-way transfer policy or a long-term international assignment policy. And similar to the way that we approached the U.S. domestic study, we really wanted to talk to people and get information from individuals who had moved receiving a full benefits package. And so that's why we isolated our respondents and candidates to participate in the study to individuals that moved under full service policies. We ended up with 149 respondents. So yes, a little bit less than the U.S. domestic study, but we did still receive or realize a 26% response rate, which again is excellent, especially for a survey that was being sent out to individuals which, as you can see there, hailed from 30 different destination locations around the world and who had moved from 52 different departure locations around the world. In addition to the actual survey, we conducted, actually Julian conducted, so we're so much looking forward to his insights into this, 35 post-survey telephone interviews. With the U.S. domestic study, we conducted 40 telephone interviews out of 546 respondents. So being able to capture 35, only 5 less, out of 149 respondents for this study really, really helped support, validate, and supplement just the hard data that we received from the survey itself. Here are some demographics from the participants in this survey. We had, again, a great mix of individuals that fell into the category of moving under either a permanent or one-way international transfer policy and a long-term international assignment policy. It seemed also a very even mix of respondents who were either moving for the very first time internationally or those who had experienced prior international moves, as you can see there. In terms of respondent age, this was interesting to see. The largest category were respondents aged 35 to 44. And then next, right behind that, were respondents aged 25 to 34. But again, a very good mix of different age ranges. And one thing I do want to point out is that we did not ask respondent age on the U.S. domestic study, but we felt that that would be very important information to look at in terms of the international study, not just in terms of slicing and dicing the data, but also to get a feel for what companies are doing and the types of employees they are moving around the world. One key data point that I thought was very interesting was that 90% of respondents were existing employees and moved with their current organization or their current employer. Only 10% of the respondents were new hires, and this certainly tells us that organizations are more likely to send current employees who have what we might call a proven track record within an organization under a formal long-term assignment or permanent international transfer policy. I want to highlight this data point because this is a very interesting data point that will play out a little bit more when Julian provides his input and insight with information he gleaned from the live telephone interviews. One of the things that we thought was very important to look at closely with this population of respondents, and particularly for this study, were individuals who had no experience previously moving internationally versus those who had moved previously, and also looking at family size. This is a data point that we looked at closely on the U.S. domestic study, and we looked at this data point closely again for this study. 23% of our respondents moved alone. So they did not move with an accompanying spouse or children. 75% moved with spouse or partner and or family, and 49% moved with one or more children. An interesting data point that doesn't show up on the slide right here is there actually were a few respondents who moved internationally as single parents. I thought that was very, very interesting to see from the data itself. And then you can see there the breakdown of respondents moving with particular numbers of children. And of course, the greatest concentration was among those employees moving with either one or two accompanying children. So obviously this is a very busy slide, and I don't plan to go into each of these word for word or dive into these in extreme detail. But really, the gist of this is to show you the different individual relocation activities and components that we asked the survey respondents to rate. And you'll see that some of the bullets or the individual activities are highlighted in red. And the purpose for that is to show how we approached this study differently from how we approached the U.S. domestic study, but also to show how we wanted to maintain a level of consistency so that we could really understand the differences between moving within an individual's home country versus moving cross-border. Those points on this slide that are highlighted in red were either questions that we revised and updated from the U.S. domestic study to make them more applicable for a global or international move, or they represent questions that we added simply because they didn't apply for individuals that would have been moving within the United States. Some of those would be along the lines of learning and understanding compensation-related specifics, including tax ramifications, compensation delivery, and pension and retirement implications. Also looking at culture and the cultural adaptation process, as well as language and assimilation in terms of a new host country or destination country language. And highlighted at the bottom right, of course, were questions around planning and preparation related to personal safety and security for individuals moving internationally. We used the same rating for this survey as we did for the prior study. Again, in order to maintain consistency and to be able to maybe draw some linear conclusions between the U.S. domestic data and the international data. So just a brief overview. An activity that was defined as a high impact for the respondents was one that the respondent felt caused him or her to lose 3 or more days combined of work productivity. A low impact activity or a low impact item was one that caused the respondent to lose fewer than 3 days combined of work productivity. And when we say combined, that means that it was extended throughout the entire transition or relocation process. So it could be cumulatively 3 days throughout that entire process, 3 or more days. So I believe we have our first polling question now.
Right, you are, Mary Beth. Give me a second, everybody, so I can get that pulled up for our audience. So we want to hear your experience or your thoughts on some of what we're talking about today. So the first question we'd like to ask you is, which of the following would you predict is the greatest productivity drain? Is it finding a residence or home in the new location? Is it local responsibilities such as driver's license, utilities, local registrations, and things of that nature? Is it coordinating and managing the immigration process? Or understanding compensation-related specifics of the move? And finally, arranging and overseeing household goods, transportation. So we'll give everyone a little bit to vote here. All right, folks, I'm going to share our results now. Well, Mary Beth and Julian, it looks like we definitely have a clear winner, so to speak. 55% of our audience, the greatest drain would be finding a home in the new location. 28% voted for the local responsibilities. We had 3% for coordinating and managing the immigration process, 10% for the compensation specifics, and 3% again for the household goods aspect of a move or assignment. So how does that play out compared to what you guys saw in the survey?
So you'll see here our highest productivity impacts from the overarching survey, and this was out of all 149 respondents. Okay, so 66% of the respondents did identify finding and selecting a residence or home in the new location as the highest impact activity. 61% identified establishing a residence in the new location, and that would include activities such as obtaining a driver's permit, getting utilities connected, obtaining local registration such as registering with the local embassy, etc., as being a high impact activity. And third in that list, or on that list, was coordinating and managing the overall immigration process. Fourth was learning and researching and understanding compensation-related specifics of the assignment or the move. And then fifth, arranging and overseeing household goods transportation. And one thing I want to point out here, 66% of respondents chose finding and selecting a residence. And for these full-on top 5, the lowest percentage that picked arranging and overseeing the household goods transportation in particular was 45%. In comparison to the U.S. domestic study, even the top impact from all 546 respondents to the U.S. domestic study was only chosen by around 50% of respondents. So I think the fact that 66% chose, and 61% and 57% identified some of these factors, is very telling that the productivity impacts felt by individuals moving internationally are much more intense than what we might see on the U.S. domestic side. So I wanted to...
I was just going to add. Sorry, I was just going to add on that. What was interesting from the interviews was that particularly the finding a new home and establishing themselves in a new location, that created quite a bit of use of using at that time and created a lot of uncertainty or stress. But that was in a lot of ways caused by having to deal with unknown processes because they were in a different country and found them quite complex compared to home. And the other comment I wanted to make about the household goods was that though in most cases that went quite well actually, but where it went wrong, then it was a real issue for individuals. So for a few that I interviewed, it was quite a headache, but for most it seemed to have gone pretty well actually.
And that may have been, Julian, and we talk about this a lot, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit later on during the presentation, is somewhat of an expectation in terms of those two activities. And to your point, going into another country and working to rent a residence in a location that has just a different format and a different process for the rental of a home or an apartment can be very, very stressful and very surprising for somebody who's not expecting that. So I do want to talk a little bit about just focus in on some of those top 5 high-impact activities. And the first one, very similar to what we saw with the U.S. domestic study, is the issue of destination support and destination assistance. So what I'm sharing here are some statistics from KPMG's 2016 Global Assignment Policies and Practices Survey. I thought this was very interesting when we look at these numbers compared to the data and, as Julian mentioned, the comments from the telephone interviews with the International Momentum Study. So according to KPMG's survey, 65% of companies provide destination services as a core policy benefit for assignees. And I do want to point out that this survey itself is primarily focused on assignment policies, not as focused on permanent transfer policies. And I would say from my experience that destination services support should be provided in both scenarios. But it seems to be much more of a focus when somebody is going for a temporary assignment versus going in, permanently or indefinitely to an international location. So that's good news in and of itself that 65% of companies provide destination services as core. 69% provide destination services via a designated vendor, but those services are limited either by the services that the provider can actually deliver and or limited to a set number of days. And we do see that as being very consistent with companies, that there's usually a cap or a maximum on the number of days of destination services that an employee can receive or their family can receive. Out of this survey as well, 33% of companies provide full destination services. That means basically no limit to the services that can be provided and often no limit to the amount of time or the amount of days that the employee and their family has access to that destination services provider. One thing that I think is very interesting out of the KPMG study is only 11% provide a specific host entity contact, some sort of buddy or mentor to the expatriate to assist with settling in. And I know Julian will dive a little bit deeper into that particular topic in terms of a host entity or some sort of buddy or mentor when he talks a little bit more in depth about the feedback from the telephone interviews. I do want to point out one thing with regards to the Momentum study as well. Out of the respondents to the Momentum study, 89% participated in or took advantage of the destination services support that the company made available to them. That's great news that the vast majority of the respondents to the study took advantage of those services. 36% of those indicated that the services they received highly improved their work productivity, and 26% indicated that it at least moderately improved their work productivity. That's also really good news. So all told, 80% of the respondents to the Momentum study indicated that there was some level of improvement with regards to their work productivity resulting from the destination services support they received. But now if we look at that on the flip side, that still leaves 20% that indicated no improvement to their work productivity as a result of participating in the destination services support that they received. Let's talk a little bit about immigration as well, because again, this was rated third highest in terms of productivity impacts. And Julian, I know that you can attest to this as well. This was a very constant theme with regards to the telephone interviews. So I won't take too much time. I want to make sure that you are able to share that information. But I do know that 1/3 of the actual 35 respondents that participated in the telephone interviews also identified via telephone that the immigration process was a high impact to their productivity. With that said, there was a definitive recognition that the immigration process somewhat, quote unquote, is what it is. And the likelihood of anyone associated with their international transfer pretty much has little to no influence with regards to changing the process or the immigration systems. And that's obviously very true when we think about immigration law. However, with that said, there was also some recognition that the immigration process lacked some direction, and some of the participants and respondents noted that the immigration process itself obviously is slow and out of the employee's control. The result of that is a significant level of anxiety, and that anxiety can obviously ultimately impact the employee's productivity on the job. I'm going to let Julian talk a little bit later about setting expectations with the employee and the hiring manager, as that was a very, again, very strong and constant theme with regards to the telephone interview. So understanding compensation and tax, again, this fell within the top 5 of the highest productivity impacts for individuals moving internationally. And overarchingly, we know that for employees moving and working internationally, perception is reality. They talk amongst themselves quite a lot. And so a perception of fairness and equity and just overall transparency with the organization is critical. Unfortunately, fairness and equity by nature are subjective and very culture-laden concepts. So one's perception of fairness and equity can be very different from another person's. An organization called Hay Group conducts ongoing studies related to the most admired companies. And these studies show that companies find tremendous value in providing employees with total rewards statements prior to an international assignment or transfer. And these total reward statements show the total value of an employee's compensation. So base pay, incentives, benefit packages, allowances, etc. So when we think about helping an employee understand compensation and tax related to an international move, being able to share that information with them seems to be incredibly helpful. Another best practice employed by some multinational corporations involves a consultation with the employee in order to review a pre-departure or pre-transfer pay statement against a post-transfer pay statement or a post-arrival pay statement. We've heard feedback from our own clients that really goes a long way to giving the employee an overarching big picture view of how their compensation is going to change when they either relocate or go on an assignment overseas. And then finally, obviously, effective communication is absolutely critical. And one of the things I know that came out of the telephone interviews was sometimes just a misunderstanding or confusion over who to go to with questions related to their compensation and tax. And so clearly identifying roles and responsibilities in this particular area is key to helping reduce the employee's stress level and improve their productivity.
All right, thanks a lot, Mary Beth. So before we move on to our next topic, we do have our second polling question for everyone. So what we would like to hear from you now is how many days of job productivity do you think an international employee loses during the relocation process? Is it 5 to 10, 11 to 15, 16 to 20, 21 to 25, or is it more than 25 days? All right, everyone. Well, me too. Share our poll results now. Okay, Mary Beth and Julian, it looks like 6% thought 5 to 10 days, 21% thought 11 to 15. Our majority, 36%, thought 16 to 20. We had another 21% for 21 to 25 days. And then finally, 15% voted for more than 25 days. So how does that play out with the findings that actually were reflected in the survey?
Okay, so let's take a look at that if we can.
All right, there we go.
So here we have our overall productivity impacts, and I do want to share just a funny interjection here. The number of times that we presented our U.S. domestic data, I'm pretty sure every single time somebody in the audience asked us, you know, when you conduct the international study, what if you find out that people moving internationally didn't even lose as many days as those moving domestically? Well, for better or for worse, that wasn't the case. I want to also, for those of you who were familiar or are familiar with the U.S. domestic study results, we were very focused on only high impact responses when we looked at that data. And we learned a lot from that. And so in looking at the data from the international study, we wanted to pull in both the high impact and low impact responses. And that's my nice way of saying that some of you were kind of right in terms of the poll and some were not. When we look at just the high impact responses, so individuals that rated certain activities as impacting 3 or more work days, throughout the transition process, the average days of lost productivity, and again, this is a conservative figure, was 24.4 days. And that, again, was only looking at high impact responses and only considering a loss of 3 days, no more, per high impact response. When we added in all of the low impact responses, because individuals that rated certain activities low impact were still identifying a productivity loss, it was just less than 3 days. And so we looked at those low impact responses as causing a 1-day loss of work productivity. And when we looked at all of those added together, the total loss was 39.21 days. We also broke it down and looked at what the difference was between first-time movers, so individuals who were moving internationally for the very first time, and they lost at a minimum 25.6 days, whereas respondents with previous moves lost closer to 23 days of work productivity. And when we published the study report, you'll see that we went and dug even deeper into that particular data set and looked at how impacts and productivity impacts change as you become a more experienced mover, and very interesting insights there. So again, let's look at the real impact here and the real key, and that's the actual cost of this lost productivity. We're using the exact same calculator model or cost model that we used for the U.S. domestic study. If we look at an international employee profile and an individual that's earning a base of U.S. 150K with all of the following added into that compensation package related to their overarching benefit load, office space and infrastructure costs, and ROI, and then looking at the number of work days per year, you can see, again, in U.S. dollars, the annual productivity loss based on a particular company's volume of move. And one thing I want to point out here, I think it's important that we look at that 250 work days per year from a global perspective and understand that this number may be lower in countries outside of the United States, where they have fewer work days per year, either due to fewer work hours per week or per day, as well as more work time or more PTO. So again, just to assert, these are conservative figures when we're looking at the actual financial impact of the lost productivity.
Thanks a lot, Mary Beth. Before we move on, we've got our third and final polling question we would like to ask our audience members today. We want to know now, which of the following countries would you predict has the greatest productivity impact on employees moving there? Is it the United States, Switzerland, China, Singapore, or Germany? Okay, let me share our poll results. Okay, it looks like 24% of our audience voted for the United States. Switzerland got a 0% vote. 59%, our majority, voted China, and we had 9% apiece for Singapore and Germany. So, Mary Beth and Julian, let me move on and we can explain how that really played out in the survey responses.
Absolutely.
Give me 1 second here.
So, interestingly enough, and I want to point out that this is looking at the destinations that had 4 or more respondents. I mentioned at the very beginning of the webinar that we had respondents from 30 different destination locations. And so we did have some locations with just 1 or 2 respondents. So we really just limited this data to the locations that had the highest concentration of respondents moving to them. And the highest impact destination overwhelmingly was the United States, actually. This kind of provides you a list of the top 8 high-impact locations. And so, of course, when we saw this data, we were probably partly surprised and partly not, and this warranted us looking a little bit deeper into what are the impacts that are different for individuals moving into the United States. And I just want to spend a few minutes on that information because I do think that it is very, very interesting and eye-opening. So 33% of all respondents were actually individuals who moved into the U.S. Again, either a permanent move into the U.S. or coming into the U.S. for a long-term international assignment. The high impact activities that were identified by this particular population were similar for the most part to the high impact activities identified by all 149 respondents. However, there were 2 that stood out for individuals that were coming into the U.S. for their move. And those 2 were managing ongoing personal financial concerns, issues, and decisions, and disconnecting from social and support networks in their home country. And so in developing the study report, we dove deep into these 2 issues to try to understand why would these 2 stand out for this particular population. The first one may not come as a surprise. We talk a lot about the challenges for national space coming into the United States with regards to credit and also the transition to a very, very different healthcare system. And so that seemed to be a significant concern and a significant productivity impact for this population. One aspect of that was actually just the expectation coming in and not having the expectation that they would be faced with the challenges they were faced with, establishing credit in the United States, obtaining a credit card, opening up a bank account, etc. And that's very telling in terms of the level of support and counseling that we are providing these individuals. The second one, disconnecting from social and support networks, was maybe not as evident as to why that would stand out. But if we think about the U.S. Compared to the rest of the world from a culture perspective, the United States is probably the most or highest rated country from an individualistic standpoint. We are in the U.S., we're a very individualistic culture. And that means that there's much more focus on the I versus the we. If you're an individual who is moving from a country that is rated very high on the other end of the spectrum, so a country that's very collectivist or has a culture of collectivism, disconnecting from the we culture and disconnecting from those very strong group connections and social networks can be much more impactful and stressful for an individual moving to a country with a much more individualistic culture and individualistic view. So again, in the study report itself, we share a lot more information diving into these 2 particular issues. So at this time, I want to let Julian speak in regards to his experiences with the telephone interviews. I know he has some interesting insights and stories to tell, and also diving a bit into some of the themes that came out.
Thanks, Mary Beth. Yeah, of the people who responded to the survey, 86 of them opted in to participate in a telephone interview. And of those, I was able to contact 35 of those over a 5-week period. Obviously, these people are spread out all over the world, so sometimes the challenges of getting hold of people, because they themselves were traveling as well, so sometimes getting hold of them was a bit of a challenge, but it was good to get in touch with 35. And those people were actually located in 18 different countries and with 10 different companies. So what I wanted to tell you a bit more about was the telephone, sort of the process of the interviews. So typically, some were cold calls and some were prearranged if I had an email address. And the interviews were planned to be 10 to 15 minutes, although some ran on to over 30 minutes actually. And I had their survey responses in hand. So what I was doing was asking them to talk further about the high impact items that they'd notified on the survey, and asked them what impacted them from a time or stress point of view and the effect on their productivity, and then asked them for suggestions for improvements for future moves or for other assignees. They understood that I was an independent consultant for Altair, and they had their company's permission to interview them. What was interesting about all the people I spoke to was they wanted to talk about their relocations, and they were actually very engaged and had opinions. So they were certainly your A1 type of person, very much into problem solving. There was no whining going on. They were very constructive in their responses. Quite impressive people, actually. One example was a person who I anticipated to be in New Jersey when I called, and they turned out, when they answered the phone, they were in Paris at the airport standing by the carousel waiting for their bag. And that lady was surprised by my call, but then went right ahead and did the interview whilst waiting for a bag. So she got on with it. So yes, very upbeat, positive individuals. So let me talk about the key findings that came out of the interviews. Just going through these bullets here. First interesting one was actually how challenging it was for many of them to culturally integrate into their company almost more than their country. That was surprising to me, and I think that was based around the fact that it took them some time to fit in, that they maybe did not have a buddy. If you remember, Mary Beth talked earlier on about the usefulness of a buddy system. So they felt quite challenged by fitting into the new organization, dealing with internal systems, IT, the hierarchy, and particularly for those who were moving, being on assignment or moving to the head office environment, is that the organization was bigger, there were more people to deal with, and the whole decision processes were more complex. So quite a lot of people focused in on that cultural adaptation to their company more than the country. In regard to quite a few actually said that they would like to have been treated like a new hire rather than an existing employee, because some of those basics of understanding how to operate in the new environment would have actually helped them. In regard to destination services, the discussion around that was a very significant part of their relocation, and where that was done well, that really helped them adapt and settle into their new location. There were some comments made, and these were reflected more around those who were coming on assignment or relocating to the US was that they sometimes found themselves working with a realtor or maybe a destination services person who had not been an expatriate themselves and sort of didn't understand their concerns and issues. So that was an interesting thing that came out of quite a few of the interviews. And in fact, what those individuals found was that they got a lot of useful help from their cultural trainer or their language trainer who had gone through the expatriate experience and was able to help them deal with some of the issues that they were facing. So that was an interesting aspect that came out of quite a few of the interviews. The other items were in regard to, although people appreciated the technology that's used with their relocation, is that the personal touch was really quite important to them, because quite often when they were trying to understand issues in regard to their relocation, that sometimes reading this in an email or on a website didn't really deal with some of the subtleties or individual situation that they were facing, and they didn't always feel confident that they totally understood the solution. So being able to talk to somebody live was very valued, so that came out strongly. And again, what they did find was that where they were facing that actually support from fellow expatriates really did help them. So they did refer to that assistance that expatriates had been through the process was good. The other probably major aspect was in regard to the hiring manager. And the hiring manager was very keen for that individual to get into their new job and get to the new location. And they found that quite stressful because the hiring manager didn't understand the process that they were going through, whether it would be immigration or disposing of their property and getting their household goods sorted out, etc. So one of the things that they felt was that a hiring manager understanding the relocation process better would lead to them putting less stress on the individual. So that was certainly an issue for them. One other aspect was some flexibility in some of the relocation benefits. Examples given to me were where they were maybe given 30 days to obtain a new vehicle when, if they've been faced with credit problems or whatever, that, obtaining a vehicle within 30 days is quite a challenge. So some flexibility around some aspects of the policy was mentioned as well. So the other item I wanted to, mindful of the time here, is I just wanted to give you just a couple of examples of the comments that were made during the interviews. The first one was that spending a little bit more goes a long way to making assignments successful. So items like cultural training or language training were seen as spend a bit more money on that, because in the scheme of things it isn't that expensive when you look at the whole cost of a relocation. And then also the post-relocation support for expats and families. And again, this came up more for the US actually, that individuals sometimes felt that once they'd moved, particularly on a permanent assignment, that they were then cut loose, and having some sort of support from other assignees would really help them. The other point I think is quite important was the activity overload, and that was that people going on assignment felt that they were overloaded with information and things that needed doing, and that meant that they sometimes missed important information. And they felt that some support in that area, when maybe priorities and sequence of events data given to them might actually help them through the process. And lastly, quite a few found that their compensation was very complex and didn't always understand that, and were surprised sometimes that items that they thought were going to be tax-free weren't, or grossed up for tax weren't, or they misunderstood other aspects financially of their package. So getting some more help in that area was certainly important to them. Okay, well, I think that's all I was going to cover. So Shan, I was going to hand back to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Julian, and of course, Mary Beth, too, for taking us through the findings of the study. Here we have our continuing education credits for those of us that are Worldwide ERC CRP holders and HRCI Human Resource Certification holders. So here are your activity ID numbers to submit credit for this session. I did get confirmation ahead of the webinar that they were both pre-approved, so when you go to apply, there should be no charge. I'm going to go ahead and leave this up so that the audience members that need them can write them down, and we'll move into our Q&A session. So give me just 1 second to check a Q&A window here, and I will address them as I see them. Okay, we have someone here asking for a copy of the presentation. Yes, I can definitely get that to you. I sent it out a couple of hours before the webinar, but occasionally different company spam folders may catch it since there's an attachment. So I've got your name, and I will make sure that you get a copy of that presentation. That is no problem at all. Scroll down here, see what else we have. Okay. Here's the second audience question, rather, that I see. It was mentioned that cultural integration was more challenging for a company perspective than from a country perspective. Was that impact greater for employees without family or with family?
So interestingly, we did look at that because we found on the U.S. domestic study that individuals who were moving alone and those who were renters had more challenges with a cultural and social adaptation to the new work environment. And we followed that vein with the U.S. domestic study through discussions around the fact that because these individuals were moving alone or they were single, the first place that they were likely to make some sort of social connection was at the workplace, and that's why it was a more impactful experience for them. When we looked at the data on the international study, there really wasn't a distinction between individuals who were moving alone and those moving with a family, which what that tells us is that when you're moving internationally, it's a high impact to your productivity regardless of your family size, and that was very evident in the data from the study. It's just that much more of a challenge, and Julian obviously touched on that in terms of the feedback from the telephone interviews and individuals wishing that they'd been treated like a new hire, finding that cultural integration into the new work environment very, very difficult, regardless of whether they were moving alone or with a family.
All right, thanks, Mary Beth. We're back to our window here. Okay. Here's our next question. Do you see productivity impacts changing as people become more experienced movers?
Absolutely, and that was something that in the study report we dive very deep into, is what impacts change and how do those impacts evolve as individuals become more experienced movers. Certain things that become higher impact as the number of moves increase. One of those is the negotiation around the compensation, benefits, and relocation support to be received in conjunction with the move or the assignment. This, I think, is somewhat understandable because individuals that have moved more than once or have multiple moves under their belts are likely more established employees. They're probably more likely to have more investments, be potentially higher ranked within an organization. If they've moved previously, they're also likely dealing with trailing tax liabilities that may exist from prior international moves or assignments in multiple locations. Also, if those individuals are more established, they may have families at this point, and so there's a lot more compensation items that they're going to be interested in, such as housing allowances and dependent education. So that's understandable. The management of the home in the old location slowly becomes more impactful to an employee's productivity as employees become more experienced movers. And again, I think that applies as well when we're talking about people who have more track record in terms of their careers, maybe more established within an organization, have bigger families, and therefore may be more settled in terms of the size or the cost of their home. Also, I think there's a lot of a sentimental and emotional focus on some of these impacts because household goods becomes more high impact as you move more frequently. And you're probably looking at people who have accumulated more personal possessions and likely own things that carry more sentimental value, which can add stress. Some of the things that become lower impact were managing relocation expenses, and we can certainly understand that. If you've moved previously internationally, you might be more experienced with the process itself, especially if those moves have been with the same company. The two things that remain very high impact were settling in and destination services, as we've talked about throughout this webinar, and also safety and security. That remains high impact and actually gets a little bit higher impact as you find somebody who's moved more often. And again, it might be that that person has family moving with them and they're now looking out and considering the safety and security of not just themselves, but their accompanying family members as well.
Just to add to that, Mary Beth, just from the interviews, what I found was that those who had moved previously were more prepared to deal with immigration, so they were definitely handled that better, and then also were smarter about their household goods shipments, that having gone through it before, that this time round they knew what they didn't need to bring with them. So they knew what to put in storage and what they really needed to bring with them. So they made better decisions. So that came out.
That's great.
All right, folks. Looking at my clock here, I think we have time for one more question. And this seems like a perfect one to close the Q&A period out on. What was the most surprising finding in the study?
Well, that's an interesting one, and Julian may have a different perspective, having spoken with 35 of these individuals. So I think from my perspective, and Julian, of course, I'll let you answer this as well, was that individuals who took advantage not just of the destination services, but also of the cultural training and language training seemed to have an enhanced experience over those that just participated in the destination services support and assistance. It seemed like, as you mentioned previously, Julian, cultural trainers and language trainers were able to maybe fill gaps that were left open in terms of the destination services support that was provided. So it seems that those individuals had a much more comprehensive experience and experienced less productivity loss by taking advantage of all of those different benefits and services. Julian, what about you?
Yeah, I think the thing that surprised me the most was that individuals didn't understand their compensation as well as they should have. You know, that they've had surprises. So a question in my mind, were they either getting bad briefings from their tax provider, or they weren't listening, or what was going on? All of it was the individual just being over-optimistic about things. So I was a little bit surprised, and it made me go back to that thought of you know, getting a total rewards summary or something may really help, because there's nothing worse than someone being dissatisfied, if you like, once they've gone on assignment, to have all that sorted out and clear understanding is really important. So that's what surprised me.
Absolutely. Great.
All right. Well, thank you, Julian. Thank you, Mary Beth. We're right here at the top of the hour, and we certainly don't want to keep our audience members past time. So I'd like to first thank Mary Beth and Julian, one, for working on this study and gathering all the information in the first place, and then certainly for taking the time to compile it in this presentation and in a format that we could share with our audience today. I would also like to thank you guys, our audience, for taking part of your afternoon and spending it with us so we could share this information with you. So from all of us here at Altair, thank you again for attending, and have a great rest of your day. Goodbye, everybody.